Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Happy late spring, early summer.
Yes, early summer, I think.
Yeah, I think we're at least today decisively into early summer. So to get to it, we've been digging into the results of the April 2024 UT Texas Politics Project poll for last couple weeks, and we released that poll last Wednesday, and we're recording this podcast on Thursday, the following Thursday. Last week, we had Darren Shaw on for our customary discussion of mostly election-related results in the poll. And you and I, Josh, took a look at, what the results tell us about where some of the key groups of voters are in terms of the Trump-Biden race, kind of in the follow-up to that podcast and that poll, that cluster of poll results. And for people listening, you'll find that in the blog section of our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And, if you're following the election and you were interested in last week's podcast, this kind of drills down and interprets some of that data a little further.
And it's a lot of numbers. I mean, again, we love numbers. It's a lot of numbers. And I mean, one of the great values of this resource, this poll, is the fact that, we can go back and say, what was going on in April 2020 between the same two candidates? But we can also go back and see what was going on in June and February of 2016 or 2012 and kind of make a little bit more, put a little more context in terms of, I think, a lot of hot takes that come out whenever, there's a poll result.
Well, and I think, and we talk about this a little bit in the post, or at least we wave at it. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about it a little bit before in the podcast. It is interesting in terms of the opportunities presented for us to leverage that data. Mm-hmm. That we do have this rematch. Yeah. Right? I mean, the rematch is a very interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I take away the whole kind of I think lack of enthusiasm I'm feeling about it is I think most people seem to be feeling about it in the polling data, just as a researcher and as someone who does this, this is kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it does give us the ability to say, here's the Trump-Biden race. With one incumbent in 2020, here's the Trump-Biden race with the other guy, the incumbent, in 2024, and we'll obviously continue to do that. Yeah. That said, today, we're going to pivot to look at some policy attitudes, and I suspect we'll do this for a little bit till the next poll, allowing for current events. And we want to focus on a topic in the policy area that's, is already part of the 2024 campaign, so we're not completely pivoting here.
Far, yeah.
Yeah. And the topic is abortion policy. Now, we polled a lot in this poll on abortion attitudes, a lot of trend with, different attempts to probe attitudes with different, probe attitudes, the underlying attitudes in different ways. And then also a lot of questions over time about, policy proposals in play at a particular time. And I think we had a slightly different approach this time, or, it was a variation on this approach that we included. So we included several questions related to abortion, in part knowing that this was one of the, is going to be one of the issues on the table for the election, and more on the table, less on the table is going to depend on how successful people trying to get it on the agenda are.
Right.
But some of these questions were repeats of what we've been tracking for quite a while, but there were also a couple of new questions. And I said the goals were a little different. I mean, look, one goal that was consistent that's, you've alluded to in terms of our overall approach now that we've been doing this for so long and we have such a well of data. We wanted to continue to track trends, see if there were big changes that might be attributed to a shift in attitudes or to the terms of the discussion or to the terms of the discussion in the aftermath of Dobbs, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. and the politics that have fallen out of that. And that's, pretty standard fare. I mean, we track trends in complex policy areas to see if, attitudes are changing and the degree to which this seems to correspond or not correspond to events, changes in policy, et cetera.
And then people complain no matter what.
Right, yeah,
Either
which,
they didn't change or because they did.
part of the service, right? But, I think we did something a little more complicated this time that I think to my memory, we kind of talked about before, but we hadn't really fully fleshed out in the poll to some degree. And that is, we wanted to look at how the common labels that are used to describe different, broadly speaking, sides, air quote, in the abortion debate.
Sets.
Yeah, positions map onto attitudes about legal access and policy. And we do this by asking questions about practical, situational judgments about women's access to abortion. And, we wanted to begin to think about what this kind of mapping exercise might tell us about the kind of post-Dobbs political and policy debates around abortion access. And maybe, a little more distantly but more complicated, the potential competition in people's minds and in the law between the rights of a pregnant woman and the rights of her fetus.
Right, which is something that I think is, a discussion that's, I think, we talk about this a lot. In some ways, we're junkies, we're really we're deep into politics. And so a lot of the times, one of the difficult part is that we ask about things, almost too early. But you can see this sort of discussion is really coming to the fore a little bit. The IVF decision in Alabama, right, was one that really brought to, I think, a lot of people's attention this notion of, essentially fetal rights and what that's going to mean in sort of this new environment. And that raises a whole bunch of other questions. And this really is sort of our first foray to sort of start to scratch at some of this because, even if this is not a policy we're talking about at the moment, it definitely seems like something we're going to see coming into the public space more and more, this competition over rights.
Well, and I think, we hadn't really talked about this, but I think one of the interesting things that I keep kind of mulling and don't know exactly what to do with, is the degree to which the legal regime and the approach of Roe v. Wade structured so much of our thinking about the issue and so much of how we polled about it. And how others polled about it before we were doing this.
No, that's right. I mean, we can get caught up on trends. And the thing that's great about having trend questions is it really does give us, more leverage in understanding the data. But it's also been the case that since the Dobbs decision, we've had to rethink how we ask questions about abortion.
Right.
And on the one hand, we do want to hold on to some of these items that we think get at underlying attitudes and some of these items that we think, are worth that still have value even in the changing context. And if anything, maybe have more value because of the changing context. But some of the questions that we've been asking for years are just blown up.
Yeah.
Because they're just not really as meaningful anymore under the new sort of
I think that's right. And I think we're in an interesting zone of feeling both, or confronting, I should say feeling, there's feelings involved, I guess. But confronting this, both the change in the situation.
Yeah.
But also what the implications of that are and the change, how that may. It's also, I think, for us, made us step back and think of, and I think a lot of people that conduct polls are doing this, how we even structure how we're approaching the attitudinal landscape.
And I mean, I don't know if we'll get into a ton of this, but, we're going to talk about sort of the questions we asked. And that doesn't even speak to all the questions that we tried to think up but couldn't figure out a good way to ask.
Right. No, I think that's right.
Because there's a lot of challenges in this space. And I think, for the questions we ended up with, which I'm pretty happy about and are pretty robust in terms of the ground they cover, there were probably, 5 or 10 others that we didn't ask.
Right.
But we, not for lack of trying to figure out how to do it, but because it's actually still so, complicated, obviously, but also, I would say the question, this is terrible now. I was going to say the question wording on these are especially pregnant, right?
Right.
There's a lot of baggage that goes along with word choice in these questions that really do, I think, if you're being at least pretty considerate about what you're trying to accomplish here, you have to kind of step back. And I think at some point, in some of these, we had to just say, this isn't going to work.
Right. Look, it's our process to be as thoughtful as we can about all the questions we ask. But, the abortion batteries are always the question, if we are trying anything new, they are always the ones I think that we labor over, in the top tier of things we labor over a lot. There's a lot, but
again, not to keep analogies, the laboring and the yeah, that's right. I think just to make a broader observation, I think that's often case when you have policy areas that have moral components attached to them.
Yeah.
That just automatically creates more complexity.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's right. So, not to make a mystery out of this, we're going to unpack a lot of numbers and a lot of questions. So I think we don't always do this. And again, this is one of those things where just somebody happens to have been or has been a student in the internship course that I teach, where they do this research project. I'm always telling them, in the kind of assignment that they are given, don't make a mystery of it.
Right.
Don't make your reader wait to see what the conclusion is. It shouldn't be that's what they're trying to say. So just very quickly, I want to summarize kind of what some of the takeaways from what we saw, and then we'll kind of unpack them and do some exposition on that. So a few points. One, as before, we've seen not much movement in core attitudes, right?
Not much movement. Basically, we're trying to say, in the wake of Dobbs and the change in the legal, regime in the state and in a lot of other states, right? But the core attitudes have stayed relatively constant.
Right.
Yeah. And and this is something that I think, we should be comfortable with, just real quick. And part of the reason we think, this makes sense is because people's abortion attitudes tend to be a little bit more elaborated. They've something that they've probably thought about. It's not like a new policy area for a lot of people. They tend to be reinforcing. So, the presence or absence of strong religious associations tend to also correspond with partisan associations and ideological associations that all push people in one direction or the other. And so therefore we don't expect the underlying change to necessarily produce, let's say, people who formerly were pro-life now all of a sudden, whoa, well, now I'm pro-choice. It's like, no, that's not what we would expect to have happen here.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, one of the places where I think the stability makes manifest is where we do see change.
Yes,
and that's, for example, and where we see changes in the responses we get in the poll, but they seem very plausibly to be responses that are not changes in core attitudes, as you're saying, but changes in response to the environment. And the key thing is this question we ask about strictness of state laws.
Right. So this is the one area where we have seen, we'll come back to the specific numbers, but ultimately more voters in Texas say they want to see the state's abortion laws being made less strict, essentially more or less since the Dobbs decision went into place and the trigger law went into effect. There's a sharp decrease in the number of Republicans who say that the law should be more strict in the state of Texas. Now, this is important here. You say, do those two things make sense? And I think you've already laid it out. I just want to hammer it home. The idea is that people say, like, people's attitudes didn't change. The laws did.
Right.
And this is a question specifically asking about the laws.
About the level of, and just to be clear, we ask, and we'll elaborate this, but just to make it clear, it's one of the questions that we talk about, and we ask this in a few policy areas recurringly. Do you think abortion laws in Texas should be made more strict, less strict, or left as they are? Right. I think really kind of more the big takeaway, or the thing we'll focus on a bit, is that the survey revealed that behind some of the core labels or positions that are often used to sort voters and to characterize very broad, often purportedly binary positions, pro-life, pro-choice, the rights of the fetus, the rights of the woman, that in these areas, people have much more nuanced judgments about when and why a woman should have access to a legal abortion when you actually give them more detail to provide a judgment about, and we'll spin that out. And to my mind, these results take us back to the complexity at the heart of the now overruled Roe v. Wade opinion, which kind of structured abortion law and the debate for several decades until Dobbs was passed, that we see in this, how public policy inevitably wrestles with balancing what most people see, as Roe did, as the competing status of a pregnant woman and the developing embryo or fetus gestating in her body. And it's a moving, and these things shift.
And I'll add to that, within the context of an individual's own sort of moral, religious, and other judgments that have to be applied to that situation.
Right. And so in that sense, if there's a big takeaway today, it's that these labels are pretty general and don't really hold very well, right? At a certain level. So now, so why don't you give us a quick overview of the questions that were on this poll that we're dealing with?
All right. So the relevant questions, on this most recent April UT Texas Politics Project poll include an item sort of in the demographic section, sort of in the back of the poll, that asks people whether they would describe themselves as pro-life or pro-choice or neither. There's this question we already talked about, the strictness of the current laws and whether the respondent, the voters, think they should be more strict, less strict, or left alone. We asked some new questions about whether state government was doing too much, too little, or the right amount to protect the rights of pregnant women. We also asked, do you think the constitutional rights and protections should be granted at conception? So this is this idea about sort of fetal rights. And then we asked a $1 million question that sort of seemed a little bit odd, and then Donald Trump said something about it, sort of as we were releasing, which is asking level of agreement or disagreement with the notion that a woman who has an abortion should face criminal penalties such as fines or jail. And that gets thrown around a lot as people say, well, nobody wants to put women in jail. Well, some people do, right? And then I think the real, meat of what we're doing here is a battery that we've run multiple times now, which is what we're doing is we ask, I'm just going to read the question to make it simple here. We say, in each of the following circumstances, how much time do you think a woman should have to obtain a legal abortion? And then they're provided with 7 different circumstances, and I'll go through what they are. And then they have a choice. They can say a woman should never be able to have a legal abortion in that circumstances. They should be able to have one within 6 weeks of pregnancy, within 12 weeks of pregnancy, within 24 weeks, within 36 weeks, or at any time during the pregnancy. And this really is, trying to hit where a lot of the policy discussions both have been in the past on these idea of like 6-week bans, 12-week bans, 20-week bans, but also where we are now, which is to the extent that, some legal abortion access needs to be elaborated in some way in some laws in some places. This really is the question about when and why. And so what are the circumstances? So let me go to the circumstances real quick. So the circumstances are the woman's health is seriously endangered. The woman became pregnant as a result of rape. The woman became pregnant as a result of incest. There's a strong chance of a serious birth defect in the baby. Then the next 3 are the family has very low income and cannot afford any more children. The woman is not married and does not want to marry. The woman is married and does not want any more children. Now, I should say about these 7, we did not write these originally. These actually came from a historical battery, which is if they feel a little anachronistic, they do to me, I think just in some sense about the way we talk about these things, but we do think that they do get at the attitudes relatively well without adding too much more complexity to it. Okay. So that's sort of the meaty battery.
Right.
What we think that battery allows us to do is, again, it allows each voter, regardless of the broader kind of labels they take on or policy position they espouse, say, well, let's rubber meets the road here. Should a woman be able to access legal abortion in each of these circumstances? If so, for how long should a legal abortion be available? Right.
Right. So before we move, I just want to to help people out. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
If you want to look at this. If you go to our website, if you go to texaspolitics.u, texas.edu, go to polling, and then go to our data archive, you'll find the top line and the crosstabs to this for the April poll along with everything else.
Yeah, and this is questions Q33 through Q37.
Yeah, so you'll be able to, if you want to kind of just look at all these, please, we invite you to do this. So what does all this mean in practice? This was kind of the question. Right. And, this was fairly purposive. What do these mean in practice to voters, who embrace or endorse a label or a position, right? That is, whether pro-life or pro-choice, fetal personhood, fetal rights versus rights of a pregnant woman within these different frames. So let's start a little bit. Let's start with the pro-life position. So pro-life is we take this as the anti-abortion position, but it's most pro-life advocates' term of choice is why in that circumstance, we use that language. So let's talk a little bit about what that data looked like. Sure. So first of all, how many pro-life identifiers are there in the sample?
Yeah. So in the sample of registered voters, 38% identified it as pro-life. By contrast, 41% identified as pro-choice. To be clear, this is a Republican-leaning sample. It's a conservative-leaning sample, as always, because it's a sample of Texas voters. We've asked this question pretty much on every survey going back quite a while now. And regardless of, what people may say in terms of describing the state as pro-life or pro-choice or whatever, when we look at a measurement of the registered voters, it tends to lean slightly pro-choice. Right. Okay. If that's surprising, you can look at the data. We can talk about it over email. So 38% of the voters identify as pro-life. Now, we look at those 7 circumstances, what we're going to focus on here. So 14% of all of the pro-life voters say that they would never allow legal abortion access in each of those 7 circumstances. So first and foremost, when we say, okay, here's all the circumstances, only a minority of voters say never.
Right, and that's 14% of the 38%.
Of the 38%. So right now we're just talking about pro-life identifiers.
Right.
So 14% say never in each of the circumstances. Now, I think it's fair to say, well, the first ones or the top one that most people would say have a problem with would be a woman's health is seriously endangered. Obviously, you could say if you're pro-life, that's not a reasonable, you're basically pitting life against each other. That's a tough one. So let's take that out. 19% of pro-life voters would prohibit abortion in each of the other 6 circumstances. 29%, now then the next sort of category we look at is sort of the 4 circumstances, which we say is sort of the 3 choice circumstances. The woman is married and does not want any more children. The woman is not married and does not want to marry. And the family has very low income and cannot afford any more children. For lack of a better term, I'm going to put it there. I'm calling these the choice circumstances.
I
don't love it, but I don't know how else to put it.
I think in giving a talk and talking about this a couple weeks ago, I said, and I didn't make this hard and fast, but kind of a non-emergency. Now that's, I could see people would quibble with that too, but I was trying to find a way, and I know you are too. That's why I'm trying to find a way to get away from the choice, not choice language.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's one thing about
I would say
us being at least among the earlier people to use this question structure is that characterizing these different things actually introduces some of the same complexities that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in the other 4 circumstances, what you could argue is that something happened outside of the person's control, whether it be a crime or a medical emergency, whether for the pregnant person or for the fetus, right? That's not something that anybody chose to have. It happened, right? I'm taking the pregnancy as a given. The other 3 circumstances are more about context in which the pregnancy happened, but not necessarily again, a crime or a health emergency. So that's why I'm calling them I'm just trying to justify for other people. I know you understand. I mean, I'm just looking ahead. So the choicier circumstances. So if we look at and this is important because the birth defect one is an interesting kind of intermediary in between the two, right? The other items, about rape and incest and health of the mother tend to have very high shares of voters endorsing some degree of access.
Right.
What's interesting is the birth defect is close, although not as high. And then these other circumstances are clearly different. If we were going to go and be fancy social scientists and do a factor analysis, the 3 choice circumstances would probably, we say, load together. They would vary pretty similarly with each other. And we see that in the data here with even less sophisticated methods. So again, among pro-life identifiers, even if we just look at the 3 choice circumstances, only 61% would prohibit any access to abortion in all 3 of those circumstances, which means the other 40% would allow some access at some point. So I think it's sort of important to know, what does this mean? Again, and we'll make this a little faster as we go along here, but more pro-life voters would allow for some legal abortion access than prohibit it in 4 circumstances, right? When the health is in danger, 76% would allow for some kind of access at some point. In the case of rape, 69% of pro-life voters would allow for access at some point. In the case of incest, 65% would allow for some access at some point. In the case of a fetal defect, 58% would allow for some access at some point. Again, about 70% would prohibit it in the choice cases, but between 25 and 28% of pro-life voters would allow some legal access in even these sort of other situations.
Yeah.
Take one other angle on, again, this sort of same group. We asked in this poll basically whether or not constitutional rights and protections should begin at conception. 40% of voters said that they should. This is this idea of sort of fetal personhood and fetal rights. Again, these numbers are actually pretty similar, right? More voters who believe that constitutional rights begin at conception would allow for some legal abortion access and prohibit it in those same 4 circumstances. So in the case of health, 77% would allow for some access, 72% in the case of rape, 68% in the case of incest, 63% in the case of fetal defects. Similar shares, about 30% would only allow for abortion in the first 6 weeks. In that scenario, about 30% would allow for anywhere between 12 and 36 weeks, which shows a lot of variance here, even within this group, talking about this issue, which is, again, very difficult, right? Between 53 and 58% would prohibit abortion in the choice circumstances, but between 39 and 43% would allow some access, mostly earlier in the pregnancy.
Right.
And so, just to take quick takeaway on these groups, when we start to talk about like pro-life, we say, fetal personhood, constitutional rights of being at conception. Well, once you start bringing up the specific circumstances and time, what you find is a lot of variance here. And really, I would say, a lot of deviation from what is seen as a binary prohibitionist position, right?
As we've talked about, it's kind of hard to figure out what that number is. But the takeaway there is that the share of people that are unconditionally, uniformly pro-life, if pro-life is to mean under no circumstances should a fetus be aborted,
right,
is really, depending on whether you look at the pro-life identifier or the common underlying thought that a fetus should have rights at conception, you're really looking at only between 10 and 15% who are absolutely
Doing the math in my head, I'd say maybe 15 and 20.
Okay.
But what I also say, it's interesting, and I hadn't done that math until right now. But when we
This
look,
is what I was talking about before we go on. I mean, it's kind of, once we parse it out this much, you have to really kind of think about.
yeah, and people don't like when you do the percentages of the percentages and stuff in terms of
right.
writing. But it's interesting. But
That's right.
But that number, that 15 to 20%, it actually coheres very, very clearly with the question that we were asking historically about abortion, which we've talked about on this podcast before. It's a 4-point question. In terms of 4 response options, essentially, the 2 endpoints are essentially no abortion ever, and then one is
never and whenever.
Never and whenever, and the middle is a whole mess. But what's interesting is that the share endorsing never in almost every poll ever conducted is about 15 to 16%.
Right.
It ranges. It can go from 14. It can be, maybe if you look at just Republicans, sometimes it bumps up to about 21. But the fact that we're seeing again in a group that's already a subset who's already identified as pro-life, what do we end up with in terms of the electorate? About 15 to 20% on the total prohibitionist position.
Yeah, right.
So about 1 in 5 of all voters would say this.
Right. And so, yes.
But that's a separate sort of discussion than the one that we're having here, which is just to say, I think that's something that gets focused on a lot.
And maybe closer to 1 in 10 than of pro-life, or, more or less.
Yeah, and so I think this is one of these discussions, right now, just because of obviously what we're talking about here is complicated, right? In the simple version, it's real easy to say only X% of voters would prohibit abortion in all circumstances. But what's interesting here is that even the voters who are, I would say, amenable to prohibitions, restrictions on abortion, once you probe those attitudes a little bit, you find out that they're not absolutists in those positions.
Right.
In fact,
and that's really kind of what we were curious about.
It is what we were curious about. Now, there's another side to this.
So let's look at the pro-choice folks.
Right. And this is sort of important because I think, one of the things that gets sort of lost in this debate is if on the one side you have this idea that there's this groundswell of support for a complete prohibition on abortion, which the simple look at the data, does not support. But now even a more complicated look at the data shows it doesn't even support it among sort of the groups of voters who you'd think of as being supportive.
Right.
The flip side of that is this argument that essentially it's a partisan argument, but I'll just make it here which is that, Democrats and pro-choice voters are for abortion up to and basically to the point of birth.
Right.
That essentially, late-term abortions, kind of the term of art.
Yeah,
the
political term of art is abortion on demand.
Abortion on demand,
right.
and late-term abortions, partial birth abortions, all that kind of stuff. And, what you're going to find here is not surprising, which is a lot of nuance among pro-choice voters, too. So pro-choice voters make about 41% of the electorate. Not surprisingly, fewer than 9% said a woman should never be allowed to obtain an abortion in each of the 7 circumstances we looked at. However, the share saying that a woman should be able to obtain an abortion at any point during the pregnancy varies significantly, right? From 68% when the woman's health is seriously endangered, all the way down to 29% for a married woman who doesn't want to have a child. What that means is that there's actually significant variation and significant support, even among pro-choice voters, for some time limits, depending on the circumstance. Right. So 29% of pro-choice voters would allow for some time limits. Essentially, these are the voters who said, up to 6 weeks, 6 to 12 weeks, 12 to 24, 24 to 36, and didn't choose at any time, whenever, right? And so these people actually specifically chose a time window. 29% of pro-choice voters said that there should be some kind of time limits when the health is endangered, 47% in the case of rape, 45% in the case of incest, 41% in the case of fetal defect, but 56% in the case of, low-income family, 55% in the case of, an unmarried person who doesn't want to basically get married or have a child unmarried, and 55% in the case of a married couple who just doesn't want any more kids, which means a majority of pro-choice voters said there can be some kind of time limits in these choicier circumstances. When we look at the people who said constitutional rights don't begin at conception, so it's 36% of voters, again, same thing. The share saying a woman should basically be able to have a legal abortion at any point during the pregnancy ranges from 29 to 69%, with the share endorsing time limits ranging from a low of 26% in the case of a health condition to 54% in the choice circumstances. Again, so a majority of those voters who don't believe that constitutional rights begin in the womb still nonetheless believe that there can be time limits on when a legal abortion can happen. Right. The last one on this one I'll go through is, among the voters who say the Texas abortion law should be less strict, which is 45% of the electorate right now, the share saying a woman should be able to have a legal abortion at any point ranges from, again, 28 to about 66%. Again, these are pretty consistent numbers you'll notice across the board, which I think is could be good for policymakers. Just going to say that out loud because it sort of ranges on both sides are pretty durable. And again, 29% would allow for some time limits in the case of a health crisis, 53% in the case of the choicier circumstances, and sort of ranging in between, about 40s for the others. And so again, that shows a fair amount of variation on the pro-choice side when it comes to, where they would allow for.
Well, and this is where you calling it choice is actually helpful, right?
Yeah,
because really what you see here is that even among, in one way or another, embrace explicitly a position that is meant to maximize women's autonomy and choice within the rhetoric of the movement, more than half will embrace some kind of limit in these choicier circumstances.
I should say,
and those limits are generally probably in the 20 after 24 weeks and the sort of 24 to 36 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, one of the real challenges in constructing, these question batteries, and it's something that kind of falls out of this, and we sort of, did very, I would say, informal pilot testing with various people. And one of the difficulties that you find is sort of this question of the range between the very end of pregnancy and sort of this idea of complete choice. And so, a lot of the time, and this is sort of what makes these questions difficult in some ways, is that the difference between a circumstance in a fetus at 24 weeks versus 38 weeks is just it's just a different question. Right. And I think, and people definitely read the question differently and have to think about it. And I should say, when you look at all of this data and you look at the distribution of it across time and circumstance, especially among the sort of the quote unquote pro-choice leaning groups or whatever, a very small cell is that cell that says, like up to 36 weeks. It's sort of, they either get pushed over into the anytime or they get pushed back into these sort of other earlier times in the pregnancy, right?
Right.
And that speaks to the fact that, one, interestingly enough, kind of not really useful now, but it does speak to the power of the partial birth framing, right? Late term abortion, that whole thing really did speak to something that clearly touches people in a very specific way. And even people who are ostensibly pro-choice, but at the same time, if you're somebody who is, identifies as pro-life, it's not so much the timing, because you definitely want it to happen early in the pregnancy. That's also clear in the data.
Right.
But the circumstance itself clearly does matter. It's not a blanket, just never.
Yeah. I mean, I think you going back to the more traditional 4-point abortion question and us kind of parsing this all out. One of the things that is interesting, as we've talked about this a bit, that it can be easy when we do 6 polls a year and you're going from poll to poll to poll to poll to poll, and kind of here's a step back, and in regard to that, to the traditional 4-point abortion question, this is, to my mind, what we always suspected.
Yeah.
It's what always made me so uncomfortable with the vagueness of the two midpoints in that abortion question, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you've heard me bitch about that for years, but I mean, this is kind of what we needed to get at, I think.
Right.
So, the big takeaway, I mean, as is often asserted by proponents of abortion rights, voter attitudes are much more nuanced than is generally acknowledged, and on both sides.
That's right.
Both sides, or at least within, within the groups of people that embrace these general characterizations. It's almost like the opposite of what we often talk about, which is voters not necessarily having deep attitudes on
deep,
things.
Nuanced thoughts.
Whether you like the results, don't like the results, whatever you make of them, there's a lot of nuance in these results, and there's a lot of relatively consistent intellectual structure to it. Yeah. Whether you agree with the person's beginning point or not, and whether you're looking at people that identify themselves as pro-life, but admit of a lot of exceptions to that commitment, a lot of qualifications, nuances to that. Or you're somebody that is pro-choice, but you give them these, and you see more examples of admitting of nuance. Now, the pro-choice position, by its nature, admits of more variance because it's just a little more of a monolithic. It's a broader position than the relative specificity and narrowness of the pro-life position, and that's not a judgment. That's just a logical description, to my mind,
and maybe
of the positions.
Yeah, maybe unfair. I mean, in some ways. I mean, I'm not saying it is, because of the way that the politics of it has manifested itself and the way it's manifested in policy makes it not unfair. But I mean, looking at the actual data, you'd say kind of unfair.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean by that? Say more about that.
Well, I mean, just thinking about I think it's important because of one thing's right. So one, we can say I think the fact that the pro-life movement has been conceived of as being, so monolithically opposed to access to any abortion is probably a disservice to that movement in some ways, right? Now, part of that has to do with the fact that the life of the mother obviously clearly matters, right? I mean, you can see that in all the data that we've asked about in multiple questions, whether this format or other questions. When the woman's health is in danger, there are very few people who say, well, too bad, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that one would be useful to acknowledge it even just in the current policy discussions we're having where these sort of clarifications need to be made. Because honestly, there's not a lot of opposition to making sure that women's lives are protected during childbirth, right?
Right.
But I think as we move forward, it's also important to take that same, I think, nuance that has been sort of absent there, right? And think about the next discussion, which is this idea of, fetal personhood, which is why we ask this question about, do you think the constitutional rights basically begin at conception? Now,
part of that is that there are all these other, some other slightly some not widely expected spin-off issues like in vitro and things
there are other reasons to ask this question, but also to the extent that the next sort of phase in this potential policy discussion or fight or battle would be, well, okay, do fetuses have rights? If they do have rights, how do we balance the rights of a fetus with the rights of a full-grown living woman who's carrying that fetus, right?
Right. Again, not to be a broken record, it just basically we have now discarded one national framework for balancing those two rights in Roe.
Yep.
And we're now finding out that actually we now have to reconfront that issue, whether it's at the state level, whether it's deciding whether it's going to be at the federal level. It's ironic is the wrong word, I guess, but this all seems to underline to me that however imperfect it was as a legal regime, the Roe framework, which had one of its foundations, the notion of balancing government interest in protecting the rights and autonomy of women with the interests of what in the decision was called a potential life.
Yeah.
And that state interest increased as a pregnancy progresses.
Right.
And that seems to be how a lot of voters on both sides view this.
Yep.
But their starting point balance is heavier weighted on one side or the other.
Well, and I think what, going through
I think.
Yeah, no, and I think going through this data, what it really uncovers, I mean, it's sort of, it's in some ways it uncovers something totally banal and very common in American politics. Like, boy, there's a lot more overlap in people's views than the political discussion would have you think. And really it is this idea that on the one hand, you're dealing with this, I mean, let me rephrase. I think even what you just said was wrong, right? Which is that you have this one side that has a starting point that's so prohibitive on the one hand, which just, let's take a pause, not true, right? The data even in and of itself actually discounts that possibility.
Well, keep going.
I guess it depends. I mean, it's tough because of the split.
Well, I don't disagree with that characterization, but I don't think, in terms of saying, well, I think the way I got it wrong, but maybe I didn't let you say about what I got wrong. But I mean, I think it's the relative, that's why I said relative weight.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, never mind. Let me.
Yeah.
Nothing you said was wrong.
No,
let me reinforce. What I was just saying is that, this idea that there's one side that has a completely prohibitionist position and there's another side that has a completely, essentially liberal in this, whenever, at any time during the pregnancy position, that in and of itself is a disservice to all the voters because the vast majority are probably somewhere in between that, right?
Even though they embrace one label or the other.
Well, and that's the thing, and this is why I think it's so, if you were to look at our poll right now and you are, staunchly pro-life to an extreme, you're part of the 16 to 21% who say never, you might look at this poll and say, hey, look, 40% of voters said the constitutional right should begin at conception compared to 36% who say they shouldn't. And therefore, going forward, going to the next legislative session, we need to enshrine fetal rights into the Texas Constitution because clearly this is where the voters are. But then you say, yeah, but what does that mean? Because ultimately the rights are only meaningful vis-a-vis the person who's carrying that baby in that time period, right? And when we look at actual attitudes about that, it turns out that there's actually a fair amount of weight given to the pregnant person in a lot of these circumstances. And so this is, again, it's so some of the things about doing all this is it's so easy to see how this debate has become so ossified and so unproductive because in some ways you are taking the two most extreme positions that nobody holds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of, on average, right? No, like a very small share of people hold these, and you're making them to be the exemplars of both sides' positions, and therefore there can be no negotiations, which is crazy.
Because people may declare that that's their position, but I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about this. They may declare that position, but in practice, it's not really their position.
No.
As we understand.
Not practically or functionally.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So to sort of wind up on sort of the more mundane elements of politics, I mean, in a very general kind of way or very loose kind of way, this does underline why there is an advantage right now for Democrats to talk about this, and there's a real desire among Republicans not to talk about it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting in the sense that, you can see that it's a lot more challenging for Republicans because of the fact that, and we talked about this before, the status quo has changed. I mean, ultimately, if you're in a state like Texas and there's no abortion access, if you're a Democrat, you can be for any abortion access, and you're probably in line with most voters because most voters think there should be some abortion access, right?
Yeah, because this, and what that does is takes us back, and this is a good place to end, to that strictness question that we flagged in the beginning and the movement that we've seen in that.
Yeah, right. The share of Texas Republicans who want more strict abortion laws has declined from 55% in April 2021 to 26% 3 years later.
And remember, April 2021 is when the most, prohibitionist Texas laws are being processed in the legislature.
Right. 26% 3 years later. That's a huge drop, right? Shares who want them less strict has increased from 9% to 26% over that same period. And approval of the status quo has gone from 29% to 35%. So some of those Republicans went from strict into sort of this is fine now, but more of them went into the make it less strict. And generally people just, again, move. Now, we should expect this. I mean, this is the idea of the policy thermometer. Our colleague Chris Leslie, writes about this idea of the way the government is going to, the public's going to respond to the government's, policy in a way that makes sense. And we see that here as the laws have changed, but it is remarkable how much even Republican views have changed. Overall, the share of Texas voters who say that the law should be less strict has increased from 33% to 45% over that same time period. Now, again, a lot of that's going to be driven by, again, these Republican voters because Democrats already had relatively liberal views of this. So as of this April, also, the plurality of Texas voters, 42%, say that the state is doing too little to protect the rights of pregnant women. So that's the other side of this, right? And this is sort of an increasing question, again, I think is people are seeking for the state to better clarify what these exceptions look like, when people can access legal abortion, what a health emergency actually looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the discussion of, the Texas Medical Board issuing,
Right. And so this is something we're going to track.
Issuing rules to regulate the implementation of the most recent round of laws.
Right. And this is something we'll probably continue tracking, as time goes on and see what happens with this.
So, there's kind of this is very complicated and, one can sort of look at this in a lot of different ways. And frankly, I'm still kind of thinking about what I really think about all this, other than that I'm pleased with the results we got. Right. I mean, as a interpretive
it hangs together
research
nicely.
exercise. I mean, I think this told us what we wanted it. We're finding, we get a view that we wanted to get from this.
Yeah.
In terms of what we're trying to estimate here.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, just without getting into discussion, looking ahead, it is going to be interesting to see, whether and how the state and what entities in the state clarify the state's current abortion laws. There's a lot of local movements right now to prohibit the movements of, pregnant people, for the purposes of gaining abortion, which, previous polling that we've done has showed is pretty unpopular. And so, I mean, what's interesting is, this is an area where I think Republicans in particular are having a really difficult time because ultimately they're being asked, well, how many weeks and when? And there's not really a good answer that doesn't turn off at least some of their voters one way or another, or potentially mobilize Democratic voters at this point.
There's an interesting thing about what the silence means on the part of Republican opinion leaders and elected officials. And I don't want to get overly cosmic's the wrong word, but there's a lot of avoidance going on here.
It's a lot of avoidance. Yeah.
An avoidance that is understandable in political terms. But there's another thing going on here. You think about how difficult some of these debates over these abortion laws have been on the House floor.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I mean, this really provides another example of why that's so, right?
Yeah.
Or gives us another view of why this so. It's an interesting backdrop to what we think about in the more mundane, very inside baseball notion of, we need to help members avoid hard votes. This is like the substance of a hard vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I was thinking,
in a way, I think.
Well, and I was
especially
thinking,
for Republicans.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason, and to reinforce the Republican thing and say why it's less so for Democrats, because of the change in status quo, any increase in access is a victory, whatever it is. Right. I mean, the fact is, if you're a Democrat in Texas right now and the legislature comes back and they wrestle out a 12-week period, that's a huge victory over where we are right now, even though it's significantly less than where the state was,
or for that matter, exceptions.
Yeah, exception. Well, yeah, anything. I'm even making a blank. Yeah, sure. Any exceptions, anything. I mean, anything would be a victory for Democrats. Given how close, the elections are, and especially nationally, this is where, you're really seeing a lot of consternation around this. I think if you're a Republican, what you're worried about is you are worried about that 15 to 21% who are completely prohibitionist. And where you do see the prohibitionist position overtaking the access position is where you'd expect to see it actually among extremely conservative voters. And so, if you're a Republican right now, one, you're thinking about Republican primaries and you're thinking about, coalitions for primary challengers, expanding abortion access even minimally is not something that, you're looking to do because you're creating a primary challenger. But also, I think even in the national election, think about how close things are, as bad as things are looking for Joe Biden right now, can Donald Trump afford 3 to 5% of the Republican coalition to stay home if he comes out saying, I think 24 weeks is good for the national? It's a good national number, right? It sounds round, Well,
which is why he's avoiding.
He's
so studiously avoiding taking any position other than that it's up to the states and hanging out there. And some states may punish women. Shrug.
Yeah, which not very popular.
It's not popular, but an interesting play in the rubric that you're talking within the.
Well, yeah, for him, he can say, well, that's the states are
right. It's a classic. I'm Trumpian, but obviously a lot of politicians. It's obviously political tactic, but Trump is very good at. It's like, well, this could happen, and I'm,
Yeah, I'm sure they'll fix it if it's not good.
Yeah, sort of not up to me. So with that, thanks, Josh. You did a lot of work prepping for this, and a good discussion on this. And I think I would really urge people to go and look at the data. And we'll be putting out some version of a digestible compilation of all this in the next couple of weeks probably. So keep an eye out for that. And with that, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. Again, that URL, texaspolitics.utexas.edu, if you want to go look for some of this data. Some of it will be included in a post on our website if you're listening to this on one of the podcast platforms at that website. But we'll probably also, it'll be too much data to cram in in one post, but one post with the podcast link. But we'll have pointers to where this data is. So thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.